In the early 1920s, many navies were faced with a hard choice: continue building their planned fleets, even as their national economies began to buckle under the strain, or, alternatively, cancel projects to try and get things sorted on the home front. As sad as it is for naval enthusiasts, the latter was most certainly the better option. Of course, no one was going to make themselves weaker than a potential rival by taking the first step. As such, you had the Washington Naval Conference and accompanying treaty. This would solve the quandary by the simple expedient of restricting everyone, or at least everyone that could build battleships at the time. One of the victims of this treaty were the Tosa class battleships of Japan, or alternatively the Kaga class. From my understanding, the Japanese go for the latter. Tosa has become the common name by virtue of that ship coming first. Regardless, these battleships, the furthest along of any post-war design, were cancelled. While Kaga would get a reprieve in the form of an aircraft carrier conversion, Tosa would not prove so fortunate. Instead, she would be subjected to gunnery trials, which I suppose is more fitting for a battleship than being scrapped. But how did it get to that point? Let's take a look at Tosa's design history and then her ultimate fate. To understand this, it's important to understand Japanese naval doctrine. The core of this, in the early 20th century, was the 8-8 fleet plan. In simplest terms, the idea that the Imperial Japanese Navy needed a battle fleet with 8 battleships and 8 big cruisers. Initially armored cruisers, but later switched to battle cruisers as those came into fashion. This was an ambitious plan for a country with Japan's resources, and they never quite pulled it off. Anytime they got close, like with the 4 Congos, technology marched on, and suddenly their fancy ships were outdated. The result of all of this is that towards the end of the Great War, the Japanese had a revision in mind. Technology had moved on to the point that the brand new Japanese ships, like the Fusos or Isseis or Congos, were already considered obsolescent. As such, anything older than the new Nagato class didn't count, so they needed a spread of new ships. This resulted in several designs: Tosa, Amagi, Ki, and the number 13 battleships, among others. Ultimately, only the Nagato pair would be completed. That doesn't mean we can't talk about the others, however. When it comes to Tosa, her design originated with Mutsu, the second of the Nagato class. This is because, initially, Mutsu wasn't ordered alongside her sister ship. The 1916 budget only called for 1 battleship and 2 battle cruisers. It was at that point that the United States announced 10 battleships and 6 battle cruisers as part of the general buildup during the Great War. Understandably, the Japanese were unhappy about that. Even that early, it was abundantly apparent that the United States would be the future rival. With great reluctance, the Japanese government approved 3 more battleships. The first of these, partially funded by donations from school children, became Mutsu. With her relatively late start, lessons of Jutland could be worked into the design instead of building a repeat Nagato. As such, one Captain Yuzuru Hiraga, a prolific designer of ships, modified the design. This design, A125, is an interesting one. While in absolute simplest terms it was a variant of Nagato with an extra twin 16.1-inch turret, this isn't entirely accurate. The overall hull form changed a bit, for example. An improved boiler technology saw the number of boilers cut down to 12 without noticeable loss in power. This allowed for trunking the exhaust into 1 funnel instead of 2. Furthermore, the secondary battery was reduced to 16 guns, still in casements, but all in the superstructure instead of the hull. Finally, the armor protection was improved. Not so much in thickness, but in an increased angle to give better protection without increased weight. In fact, the design was intended to only displace 33,800 tons at standard loading, in comparison to Nagato at 32,720 tons. At some point in the future, I might do a video on Hiraga's designs, because these are fascinating as they look into Japanese battleship and battlecruiser design. For the moment, I'll round this off by saying A125 never ended up going anywhere, as I have already done a video on Mutsu, and she was a repeat Nagato. As previously mentioned, Mutsu was partially funded by donation. Building her to the A125 design would have cost more and taken more time, neither of which the Japanese were enthused by. However, it is important to mention this attempted redesign of Mutsu, because through various other redesigns, it would eventually form the foundation of Tosa. Remember, the Japanese had authorized 3 battleships in the face of the American buildup. Mutsu was one, but that left 2 more. Since a fresh slate design would have been incredibly time-consuming to work up, Hiraga simply continued where he had left off with A125. A126, through several variations, was the first attempt. This led into A127, which was either the final design for Tosa or the basis for the final design. Most sources will tie A127 to the battleship, but at least one source I found lists some minor but notable differences between this concept and the final design. Regardless, the core of the design is the same. While A125 was an attempt to improve on Nagato without a drastic increase in size, Tosa would prove to be a much larger ship. It's interesting to look at when you consider that the original idea of adding a 5th twin turret resulted in such different designs. In this case, Tosa displaced 39,900 tons, just shy of 40,000, at her standard loading. Her full load pushed that up to around 44,000 tons, at least by design. Nagato, if you'll remember, was roughly 33,000 tons at her standard load. This probably does seem fairly drastic of an increase, but at the same time, it's probably a more realistic increase for the capability, compared to adding a 5th turret while being roughly the same size and speed. In any event, this tonnage allowed for a ship that could carry 5 twin turrets. These carried the excellent Japanese 41cm, 16.1-inch gun. The turrets were mounted in the same manner as on the preceding battleship, for the most part. A superfiring pair just ahead of the bridge. A second superfiring pair towards the stern. Where Nagato would have had empty space behind the superstructure, Tosa carried a 5th turret. This created a cluster of 3 turrets on the stern, with the middle turret superfiring over the final one. The general idea of 5 turrets, with 3 clustered on the stern, would become the generic Japanese layout for these post-war designs. While different in the placement of the 3rd turret, both Amagi and Ki would follow the same general pattern. As for the secondary battery, this was identical to Nagato. 20 14cm, 5.5-inch guns, encasement mountings. Where Tosa differed was in the layout of these guns. They were mounted a bit higher in the hull, as part of the constant battle to make this type of weapon useful in anything but absolute flat calm. How well this would have worked in practice, we'll never know. Rounding out her gun weaponry, Tosa was designed to carry 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, with the potential to replace them with larger 4.7-inch guns on a 1-to-1 basis. That just leaves the torpedo tubes. In classic Japanese fashion, Tosa's design included a remarkably heavy torpedo battery. 8 24-inch torpedo tubes, in fact. 4 above water and 4 submerged beneath the surface. The effectiveness of these would have been minimal, but you can't fault the Japanese for being on theme. In any case, as things currently sit, Tosa is about 7,000 tons of extra displacement for bigger torpedoes and 1 extra turret. What about her armor protection? Well, this is where the story gets a bit problematic. Tosa actually had a thinner armor belt than her predecessor. 11 inches, or 280 millimeters, compared to 12 inches, or 305 millimeters. This was a compromise in a lot of ways. Tosa was a longer ship than Nagato, and required more weight of armor to cover that longer hull. It simply wasn't possible to have a belt of the same or increased thickness while maintaining the needed coverage and speed. To try and get around this, the thinner belt was sloped, a maximum of 15 degrees of angling, in fact, which would have improved the practical protection. Even with armor angling, though, Tosa was distinctly under-armored in comparison to her competition in South Dakota, G3, regardless of what the British called her, and N3. Even the turrets were relatively under-armored, with 12 inches of armor at the thickest. It's telling that when these turrets were placed on Nagato and Mutsu during their refit in the 1930s, the armor was improved by additional plates. To the tune of increasing the face armor to 18 inches, you can see this extra armor quite clearly on pictures of Mutsu's salvaged turrets, as seen here. In any event, that just leaves the deck armor. This seems right in line with contemporary foreign designs at around 4 inches, 102 millimeters at its thickest. However, the armor was of a layered type, a 2.5-inch plate on top of a 1.5-inch plate. While theoretically adding up to 4 inches, it would have fared less well in active service. The torpedo protection, meanwhile, would have featured an internal torpedo bulge in front of a torpedo bulkhead, as well as a thin splinter bulkhead should anything defeat the first 2 layers. Although, with weaponry and armor done, that just leaves her speed. This is important because basically every compromise in protection was necessary to maintain a specific set speed. Tosa had to be capable of operating in formation with the Nagatos. This was a hard requirement to enable a mostly cohesive formation between the 4 battleships. This meant that, in spite of the extra tonnage and firepower, Tosa needed to reach at least 26 or so knots. While propulsion technology had improved, it hadn't improved by that much. In the end, Tosa needed to manage the same 26.5 knot top speed of her predecessor. This was provided by 12 boilers, producing 91,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. In spite of the general shift to oil-fired boilers across the world, Tosa maintained a mixed propulsion system. 8 oil-fired boilers, and 4 that used a mixture of oil and coal. The end result of all of this? A relatively fast ship, although slower than the battleships in all but name, G3. A heavily armed ship with 10 16.1-inch guns and 5 twin turrets. Although South Dakota managed 12 of her own 16-inch gun, while G3 had 9, and N3 carried 9 18-inch guns. And a ship with fairly thin armor, especially by the emerging new standard. Hiraga did the best he could, but simply put, Tosa was already becoming outdated. Why do I make a point of comparing Tosa, an earlier design at her core, to the others? Simply to demonstrate how rapidly technology was progressing, and why Tosa was rapidly overhauled by the number 13 design, with 18-inch guns, as the biggest and best Japanese design. This is crucial to keep in mind, because it's part of why the Japanese, ultimately, accepted the Washington Naval Treaty. This saw everything newer than Mutsu cancelled. While the Japanese didn't like the restrictions much, it did mean that their newest battleships were more than a match for the newest ships in other navies. It also eased a rapidly approaching financial collapse had the 8-8 plan continued. Unfortunately for naval enthusiasts, it also meant that Tosa and Kaga, both of which already well along in construction, had to be canceled. Kaga, laid down in July 1920 and launched in November 1921, would ultimately survive the treaty, only by virtue of Amagi, a far better fit for aircraft carrier conversion, being wrecked by the Great Kanto earthquake. This required a replacement, and Kaga was chosen for the role. However, her story can wait for her own video. Tosa, laid down on February 16, 1920, and launched on December 18, 1921, was not so lucky. Work stopped on her in February 1922, and she would ultimately be stricken on April 1, 1924. Her hull was mostly complete by this point, with barbettes in place, as well as much of her core superstructure. Her conning tower was also installed, which allowed it to be outfit as a simple bridge. That's responsible for the weird-looking bridge you see on pictures of the ship. Bridge wings poking out from a small structure. In the end, this largely complete hulk was towed out for gunnery training. From June 1924 through the start of 1925, Tosa was subjected to just about anything the Japanese could throw at her. Simulated bombs, simulated mines, torpedoes, gunfire, you name it, it was probably thrown at the unfortunate battleship. This testing would have major implications for Japanese design going forward. The most pertinent, however, came from the same thing. During the testing, Tosa was hit by 2 shells that fell short. These proceeded to punch through the thin armor beneath the waterline, with one exploding in the port engine room after sailing through the water and then through the armor. This let in about 3,000 tons of water, and, I imagine, would have had nasty implications for anyone inside that engine room. The Japanese looked at this and had a classic light bulb over the head moment. The future super battleship design would see her belt armor pushed to well below the waterline. And the Japanese decided that the fluke of these shells was something they really wanted to make a proper thing. This resulted in the infamous diving shells of the Second World War, where the end result was Japanese fuses were too long, and their shells liked punching through light targets without exploding. Regardless, Tosa had served her purpose. In January 1925, the Japanese Naval Ministry gave a month to scuttle her. Anything useful was stripped from the hulk, and Tosa was towed out to sea. It took a few attempts, but by February 9th, 1925, Tosa had slipped beneath the waves. At this point, I'm not sure what became of her wreck. I've never been able to find anything on if she was rediscovered, salvaged at some point, or simply forgotten about. If anyone knows that, by all means, let me know. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.